The First Great Awakening. That was the topic that I was assigned. I want to thank Brother Guyton Montgomery and the elders. My name is David Warren, and I have spoken at the church in the lectureship 2 years ago. And I'm grateful that I can speak again. My topic is the First Great Awakening. A lot of historians say there have been 4 awakenings, 4 great awakenings. And here they are listed. The First Great Awakening, 1730 to 1760. Different historians will give different dates. No one actually held up a sign and said, "We're beginning the First Great Awakening," and nobody held up a sign in 1760 and said it was ending. So these are approximate dates that they assign to certain events that took place that we're going to talk about. Awakening, in the sense that we're using it, refers to a religious revitalization or revival. Awakening, of course, literally refers to rising up from a sleep, but it can have a figurative or a metaphorical meaning, to revive one's interest, or a revival of one's interest or attention. And awakening was actually the term used by contemporaries back in the 18th century, describing the religious phenomenon of which they were participants. For example, notice here, we'll talk about this a little later, the famous sermon by Jonathan Edwards, and "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." In the subtitle of the sermon mentions it was preached in Enfield, Connecticut, July 8th, 1741, a Sunday, at a time of great awakenings, and attended with remarkable impressions on many of the hearers. And notice there, Jonathan Edwards, pastor of the Church of Christ in Northampton, Massachusetts. Church of Christ here, though, being a congregational church. But Jonathan Edwards writes the next year after the sermon, in 1742, a book entitled "Some Thoughts Concerning the Present Revival of Religion," in which he uses the term awakening to describe what's taking place. Many, he says, are under great awakenings, plural, and many are converted, and many of God's saints are filled with divine light, love, and joy. Awakenings or revivals of religion, he talks about. Awakenings of conscience. The awakening of God's church out of their lethargy, their lazy or sleepy disposition. He says on page 177, "And that true Christians, when they come to be, as it were, waked out of sleep, a spiritual sleep, and to be filled with a sweet and joyful sense of the excellent things of religion by the preaching of the gospel." The capitalization here is original with the 1742 edition of this writing. He says on pages 85 and 86, "The work has been very glorious and wonderful in many circumstances and events of it, that have been extraordinary, wherein God has in an uncommon manner made his hand visible and his power conspicuous, as in the extraordinary degrees of awakening, the suddenness of conversions in innumerable instances, in whom, though the work was quick, yet the thing wrought is manifestly durable. It will be lasting. The term awakening was also used even by the opponents of the First Great Awakening. One of the greatest opponents was Charles Chauncey. He actually preferred to refer to what was taking place as a delusion. He was a Boston preacher for the First Church, Congregational Church there in Boston. He greatly disliked Jonathan Edwards, and he was a harsh critic of both Edwards and the First Great Awakening movement. A lot of historians believe in what they call a Second Great Awakening, 1800 to 1830. Again, the dates will vary a little bit. A Second Great Awakening began in 1800. It is sometimes referred to as the Great Western Revival because it took place primarily in Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, and the adjoining states. In the 13 colonies, there was a definite decline in religion soon after the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, which erupted in 1754. This decline in religion continued with the Revolutionary War and its aftermath. The French and Indian War, James DeForest Murch writes in his history on the Restoration Movement, Christians Only. He says, the French and Indian War and the American Revolution had so disturbed the ideals and customs of the people that their regular observance of the Lord's Day and the ministry of churches had been widely disregarded. And then the Church History by Garrison and DeGroot, they write, there was probably never a time before or after when there was as large a percentage of religious indifference and of positive hostility to organized religion in America as during the last 2 decades of the 18th century, 1780 to 1799. Again, part of that period being the latter part of the Revolutionary War. So was there really a Second Great Awakening? In truth, however, the First Great Awakening had never really stopped in the South. In North Carolina, Virginia, and Kentucky, the Baptists continued to grow rapidly. A revival in Virginia that began in 1785 added thousands of new members to the Baptist churches and to many other denominations in this state. The French and Indian War and the American Revolutionary War were fought mostly in the North, and so their influence was not felt so much in the South. This Second Great Awakening, or the Great Western Revival, holds a special place of importance for the beginning of what became known as the Restoration Movement. In their church history of the Restoration Movement, Garrison and DeGroot write, this Western Revival is important in the history of the disciples of Christ. This Western Revival, again, others call it the Second Great Awakening. It's important because it furnished the setting and part of the impulse for the movement with which Barton W. Stone was associated. Kentucky, at the turn of the century, was on the verge of a great revival, Earl West writes in his Search for the Ancient Order, and Stone, Barton W. Stone, felt it coming. Others would identify a third Great Awakening in the years 1890 to 1920, and a fourth Great Awakening. For example, the book by Robert Fogel, According to Fogel, this Great Awakening, this Fourth Great Awakening, took place between 1960 and 1990. The 1960s, 1970s, they saw a resurgence in Christianity, and it was brought about primarily by evangelist Billy Graham with his very effective evangelistic crusade. Now, what caused the First Great Awakening? That's really the focus of the rest of this lecture, is the First Great Awakening. Church historians find it very difficult to determine the circumstances that led to the First Great Awakening. Why did it take place here in the New World, or what later became the United States of America, rather than in England or in some other place in Europe where Christianity had been around for many centuries? For many church historians, the cause or causes that led to this great revival remain a mystery. Mark Noll, in the Erdman's Handbook to Christianity, writes, "It is much easier to chart the course of the awakening, to sketch the activities of its prominent leaders, to note the attacks of such opponents as Boston's Charles Chauncey, and to record the reactions of lay people like Benjamin Franklin and Nathan Cole than it is to say exactly why it all took place. What caused it all?" Some historians assert that the First Great Awakening began in the Middle Colonies in the 1730s and spread north to New England and then south to other areas of the South. But others state that the roots of the First Great Awakening actually go back to England, the country, Great Britain. And this is what Sidney Alstrom argues in his religious history of the American people. He explains that the First Great Awakening here in the United States, the 13 colonies at that time, was a part of a great international Protestant upheaval manifested in pietism on the continent, that's Europe, Germany, especially among German Lutheran churches, and in the evangelical revival in Great Britain. However, the impact of these renewal movements in England and the European continent pale in comparison to the tremendous growth that took place in the 13 colonies of America. So why such a difference? Why is there a difference in how it grew here in the 13 colonies of America and how Christianity slowed in England and in Europe and other parts of the Western world? Historians have sought an answer to this question. Why did the Great Awakening happen here in America and not in England or the rest of Europe? They try to note special circumstances here in the 13 colonies that were not found in England or Europe at this time. So they're trying to attribute what happened to these special circumstances here in the colonial America. In his History of Christianity in the World, Clyde Mantrick writes, "During the 170 years between the founding of Jamestown in 1607 and the Declaration of Independence in 1776, despite a large variety of religious experiences, a common ethos pervaded the American scene. God had opened up a wilderness in which to establish his paradise. The settlers from Europe who were seeking refuge and a new start in life would be his agents. The dream of the kingdom of God would be realized in the New World. Throughout the colonies, the mystique took hold that God was using them to work his mysterious purposes in history, to turn a wilderness unspoiled by the evils of the old world, into a righteous paradise. Jonathan Edwards and several others who were actual participants in the First Great Awakening and who witnessed the thousands of conversions that took place viewed it as a special outpouring of the Holy Spirit. In his 1742 treatise, Some Thoughts Concerning the Present Revival of Religion in New England, Jonathan Edwards believed that God himself had chosen the 13 American colonies, and specifically New England, as the place for his explosive renewal of Christianity. America, he writes, has received the true religion of the old continent, but because that continent has crucified Christ, they shall not have the honor of communicating religion in its most glorious state to us, but we to them. It is agreeable, he writes, to God's manner of working when he accomplishes any glorious work in the world, to introduce a new and more excellent state of his church, to begin his work where his church had not been till then, that the work might appear to be entirely God's, and be more manifestly a creation out of nothing. And if we may suppose that this glorious work of God shall begin in any part of America, I think, if we consider the circumstances of the settlement of New England, it must needs appear the most likely of all American colonies to be the place whence this work shall principally take its rise. Edwards expressed the hope that God would make New England a kind of heaven upon earth. God has greatly distinguished some of the inhabitants of New England from others in the abundance that he has given them of the good things of this life. Clyde Manshrick writes, there were wild excesses of groaning, screaming, singing, fainting, writhing, weeping, and rejoicing. That's what marked many of these meetings, the conversions that took place. Edwards regarded that what was transpiring was a remarkable outpouring, a remarkable pouring out of the Spirit of God, which thus extended from one end to the other of this country. Now, why did the First Great Awakening happen here in America? Well, other historians, several of them, have suggested that environmental factors, rather than spiritual forces or divine purpose, lay behind the First Great Awakening. A severe outbreak of some terrible contagious disease, throat distemper or diphtheria, or smallpox, or an Indian raid often preceded each surge in conversions. Others point to the great earthquake that shook much of the eastern New England on October 29th, 1727. Gostad writes, on one Sunday night, October 29th, 1727, New England's earth quaked and trembled. So did many of its citizens, who gathered around the churches early the next day. In response, William Youngs writes, there was a religious revival in many towns, which encouraged the ministers to believe that the regeneration and reunification of communities would lead also to renewed respect for their ministers. However, since there were no reported deaths, the people's fear soon subsided, and so did their interest in religion. Some suggest economic worries and fears over Britain's declaration of war against Spain in 1739 fueled the fervor of religious revival. Others speculate that the shift from rural and agricultural to urban and commercial styles of life may have engendered guilt in those leaving the old ways behind. Or perhaps it was tensions between generations over the generation of diminishing amounts of land may have created these feelings of guilt. Mark Knoll in the Erdman's Handbook to Christianity in America writes, all of these observations lead toward the conclusion that environmental factors prepared the colonial population to embrace a spiritual message which, even if it could not deal directly with such problems, brought inner peace and an escape from guilt. However, perhaps a better explanation has less to do with circumstances here in America that were absent in England and Europe, and has more to do with circumstances in England and Europe that, for the most part, were absent in America. In other words, the opposite. During the 2 centuries that followed the beginning of the Reformation, England, and indeed all of Europe, became locked in a seemingly endless series of wars that caused the Reformation to stall.